Welcome to Atma Nirvriti Chapter 13. Vicharam, Vicharamalla, the non-existence of thought. Atmananda is slowly opening up the pathway between Drishti, Srishti, Vad and Ajatavad. So this is an opening through which we are moving towards Ajatavad. We started Ajatavad actually in chapter 12, where we recognized the non-existence of the objects of senses. In that chapter, if you have been following it through your own experiential recognition, you would have by now become very clear that neither the perceiver of objects, nor the process of perception, nor the perceived object exist independently of either consciousness. You can call it the witness consciousness, the sense of I am, or as Atmananda calls it, the I principle. They are simply a single screen thought, just like a dream thought. In a dream in the night, the seer, the seeing, and the seen are all present simply as a single thought, a single dream thought. The same thing is in the waking state. The hearer, hearing, and heard are simply a single thought, a waking dream thought. It's a single screen. The smeller, smelling, and the smelled are simply a single screen thought. The taster, tasting, and tasted are simply a single screen thought. The toucher, touching, and touched are simply a single screen thought. If you dive closer, you will see that it is not even a thought. It is just for the sake of communication, for the sake of convenience, that we are even calling it a single screen thought. But when you really dive into it, it's not even a thought. Moment to moment, the thought disappears into pure consciousness again and again and again. This single screen is my true nature. So if this opening has happened for you, then you are eligible to move forward with Ajatavad. Now in this chapter, Atmananda proves even the non-existence of thought. He has already proved the non-existence of objects. He uses the same objects to reach a point in your own experiential recognition, in your direct experience, aparoksha jnana, that thoughts are non-existent. So let's see how Atmananda describes the same. But before we move ahead, we have to understand three planes. Atmananda will be referring to three planes. So let's see what are these three planes. The three planes are the plane of senses, the plane of the mind, and the plane of knowingness. What is the plane of senses? The gross world of objects, where the senses are. The senses also belong to the same gross world of objects. The senses perceive the gross object. Second is the plane of the mind, where this particular perception becomes an idea. It becomes either a thought, or it evokes sensations, or it evokes feelings. That is the plane of the mind. And the plane of knowingness, the I principle, or the sense of I am, or the witness consciousness, knows that particular object or the thought evoked, or the sensation evoked, or the feeling evoked by it. Very clear? This is the way we see at Drishti Srishtivada, that there is a plane of senses, there is the plane of the mind, and there is the plane of knowingness. And I am the witness to the plane of senses. I am the witness to the plane of the mind. When I forget my witnessing position, I become one with these, and I forget myself, and I get consumed. So Atmananda moves forward and explains to us a little more in detail about these planes. He says the plane of the senses is limited by time and space. Yes, means this plane of gross objects. If I take the position of the body, I see everything as a gross object. The camera, the computer, the wardrobe, the window, the walls. These are gross objects. This is a gross body. This body and these objects have length, breadth, height. That is the limitation by space. And they are limited by time. There is time in this gross world. So this plane of senses is limited by time and space. Now I take one step beyond this body and the world to the level of the mind. Mind has no space. There is no length, breadth, height at the mind level. But there is time. So this gross world is limited by time and space. The mind is not limited by space. It is only limited by time. I take one more step beyond the mind to the level of I, the witness. I, the principle, or the sense of I am. At this level, is there time? Is there space? No, it is beyond space and time. The plane of senses, where perceiving happens. In that plane, every single organ of perception claims to be the king. For example, the organ of sight asserts that the world is only form and nothing else. Why? Because the eye can only see. The eye cannot hear, cannot taste, cannot touch, cannot smell. So it wants to be the king, and it says the world is only form and nothing else. What does the organ of hearing say? The organ of hearing says that the world is only sound and nothing else. Yes, because the ear cannot see, cannot smell, cannot taste, and cannot touch. So it says the world is only sound. Similarly, the organ of smell says the world is only odor. The organ of taste says the world is only flavor. The organ of touch says the world is only texture. Each organ says that it is the king. It rules the world. And each sense organ denies the evidence of the other four organs. And it's done with equal force. So it's really a hopeless mess of contradictions. This mess itself proves that this world of objects is false. But how do we see it? We see this world of objects as real. Yeah? The plane of senses, we see it as real. Atmananda says, no, really look. In this false plane of senses, if you look clearly, the object that is projected is actually superimposed on Brahman. Just like the snake is superimposed on the rope. And what does this superimposition do? This superimposition attributes permanence of Brahman to the form. So that is why I feel that these objects, this world of gross objects, is permanent. Why did this wrong idea develop in the mind? Because of the superimposition. Because these objects are superimposed on Brahman. Just like the snake is superimposed on the rope. Yeah. When we wake up, we see there is no snake. Similarly, when you wake up, you will see there are no objects. There are no objects. The superimposition gives me the wrong idea. And this idea of permanency exists where? It doesn't exist in the gross world. It exists in the plane of the mind. So every organ asserting that the world is its soul, that it is the king of the world, this whole contradictory mess between the organs of senses gives a false idea of permanency which gets saved at the plane of the mind. And then the mind uses that saved information to work from. So it thinks everything is permanent and it attributes a name and a form to everything. Yeah. This superimposition deludes one into thinking that the name and the form that is attributed by the mind belongs to the object. And this object is permanent. Again and again look, what is name and form? Isn't it nothing but thought? And if you dive into thought, you will notice that a thought is nothing but a wave that arises and falls. That means it is born and it disappears. It is born and it disappears. So the idea of permanency of the name and form in the mind, that idea is born and it disappears. The name and form, of the object is nothing but a thought. It is born and it disappears. And above all, if you examine the object, you can never really prove the existence of the object. All you know is your own perception. You only know perception of sight when you look at the computer. You have no solid evidence of the existence of an object called the computer. So when you stand as the mind, moving away from the stand as the body in the gross world, when you stand as the mind, you will see that all I really have proof of is my perception. In this example, perception of sight of the computer. And what is perception? Perception is nothing but thought. And this thought arises and dissolves and disappears. Where does it disappear into? Into the plane of knowingness, into pure consciousness. Now remember, I, the witness consciousness, cannot directly know the thought. I, the witness consciousness, arise along with the wave of that thought and dissolve with that wave of the thought. In pure consciousness is where knowing happens. In the void. That is why there is a pause. And after the pause, the understanding happens. Notice that. Whether there is a thought, whether there is a feeling, whether there is simply perception, there is always a pause. In that pause, everything dissolves into the void, into the pure consciousness. Both I, the witness, and the perception, both dissolve into the pure consciousness. And that is where knowingness really happens. So though we say that the I principle or the sense of I am or the witness consciousness is witnessing, it cannot directly witness. We will understand this as we move forward. So Atmananda says that to get beyond this delusion and this superimposition of the forms on Brahman, what does one have to do? One has to move his stand from the body, from the mind, to the plane of knowingness, to the I principle. Hope the three planes are crystal clear. I just gave you a basic introduction to the planes. We will now go into the verses to understand what Atmananda is pointing towards. Verse 13.1. Verse 13.2. So what is he pointing towards? He's saying that they are at different planes. It is obvious that that which belongs to one plane cannot come in contact with that which belongs to another plane. So he's saying that thought that exists at the subtle plane, limited by time, cannot come into contact with a gross object that exists on a gross plane of senses, which is limited by time and space. They are on two separate planes. They cannot have connection. They cannot make contact because of the two separate planes. Is this clear? This world of gross objects is limited by time and space. Thought exists on a subtle plane which is limited only by time. Because of two separate planes, there cannot be connection between thought and object. They cannot come into contact with each other. Therefore, one can never say that I think of a particular gross object. You cannot. Thought cannot come into contact with a gross object. And if you say you do, he says you are wrong. Let's understand this a little more clearly. It is the mind that is making a claim that I perceive gross objects. Correct? Mind is equal to thought. Thought is equal to mind. There is no difference. Mind is at a subtle plane. Do you notice that the thought exists at a very subtle plane compared to the gross object in front of you called the computer or the table or the wall? Or even this physical body, your own physical body. All this is the gross plane. Thought is at a subtle plane. Even if the thought is about the body, even if the thought is about the computer, even if the thought is about the gross objects, thought is at a subtle plane. Do you notice that? This gross objects plane is limited by time and space. Your objects have length, breadth, height. That is space. And it is limited in time. Yeah. Look at the thought about the computer. The thought is not limited by space. There is no length, breadth, and height to the thought of the computer in the mental space. Is this clear? Yes, it is limited by time, but not by space. So these are two separate planes. Clearly? Yes. In order to perceive, the mind would have to become limited by space and then come down to the gross plane. Can the mind come down to the gross plane? Can the mind become limited by space and come down to the gross plane? No. It cannot come down to the gross plane to perceive the gross object, to know the gross object, or to even witness gross objects. What is the other option? That a gross object gets transformed into the subtle to be witnessed by the mind. Is this possible? This is also not possible. This means that the mind can never perceive the gross. The mind can never witness the gross. The gross exists only in mere words. Why is that so? Because the only evidence of the existence of a gross object is the mind's knowledge. And what is mind's knowledge? Mind's knowledge is nothing but name and form. Again, what is name and form? Nothing but thought. How can thought be proof of the existence of a gross object out there? In the night, you look up at the sky, you see that circular white form in the sky is called the moon. Do you have proof of the existence of the moon? No, it is mere words, circular, white form up in the sky. Nama, Rupa, name and form is nothing but thought. Thought is the only evidence that you have. But thought cannot prove it to you that that gross object really exists, because thought exists and lives and dies in this mental space, in this mental plane, in this subtle plane. It cannot step out of this plane to go to the plane of gross objects to prove to you that the gross object exists. Therefore, as I do not have any proof of the existence of a gross object, I cannot think of a gross object. And to say I can think of a gross object is wrong, because thought cannot come into contact with the gross object. Let's look at verse 3. We have discussed earlier that there is only one arising at a time. There is either the perception, or a thought, or a feeling, or a sensation, or the void, the interval in between two arisings. Without this interval, you could have never distinguished between two mental activities. There is always an interval, a gap, a void in between two arisings. In that interval, what is there? There is no thought, there is no feeling, no perception, there is no physical body, there are no sense organs. There is no waking state, no dreaming state, no deep sleep state. It is just void, but you are definitely there. You are there in between two mental activities. In that interval, you understand the knowledge that is being conveyed by the arisings. You are in your own real nature. That real nature is divested of this body, of the senses, and even the mind. These are not there. You are in your own true nature. If this is clear that there is only one arising at a time, it will also be clear that when there is an arising belonging to the plane of senses, nothing else is there. If there is an arising belonging to the plane of thoughts, nothing else is there. When there is this knowingness void, nothing else is there. So this implies two things. What we saw in the previous verses, that there is no contact between a sense plane arising and a thought plane arising. The subtle thought cannot come in contact with the gross object. They cannot have a connection. This clearly means you cannot think of a gross object. The second thing it implies is there can be no contact between two arisings in the same plane. Thus, the subtle thought cannot come in contact with another subtle thought, nor have a connection with it. They do not talk to each other. This clearly means that a subtle object cannot take its rise in thought. Subtle objects cannot take rise in thought. Because a subtle object is nothing but another thought. It is another thought form. One thought cannot exist inside another. Is this very clear? There is always that interval, that gap, the void in between two thoughts. So far, Atmananda has very clearly explained to us that we have no proof of the gross world because the only evidence I have is what thought tells me about a gross object. But thought can never step out of its subtle plane and go to a gross object to be able to give me proof that the gross world really exists. They cannot talk to each other because they are two separate planes. Second, can a subtle object be there? No. A subtle object taking a rise in thought itself would mean two arisings together without the void. This is not possible. One thought can never exist in another thought. Yes? So there is nothing like gross object and there is nothing like subtle object either. This is what Atmananda is going to tell us in the next verse. Let's look at verse 5. So in verses 5 and 6, Atmananda is drawing our attention again to the non-existence of an object, not only at the gross level, but even at the subtle level. He's saying that at the subtle level, a thought can never hold an object. A thought is objectless. So, what is an objectless thought really? An objectless thought is nothing but knowledge. So, it cannot even be called a thought. Knowledge itself is pure consciousness. A thought does not exist. This objectless thought, this single screen, is objectless. Look carefully. There are no objects there. There is not even a thought there. It is simply knowledge, simply jnana. It is formless, it is changeless. It is that which is pointed to by the word I. This is not different from I. The sense of I always has the extension of this knowledge. This objectless thought is not even a thought, it is knowledge. The moment this ignorance about objects drops off, immediately the jnana, the knowledge of truth, is revealed. Why? Because the snake is superimposed on the rope. No? It happens instantly. The moment the snake disappears, the rope is revealed. It happens together. Till the time I see the snake, I cannot see the rope. Till the time you hold on to the idea of the permanency of objects, you will not be able to see the truth. The gross world is superimposed on Brahman, on I, the Brahman. So discard the snake. There is no snake. What is simply the rope. From the knowledge of an object, discard the object part. What remains is pure knowledge alone. This knowledge is the essence, it's the background of everything. It is also I. Thus, a thought can never have an object. It has no gross object nor subtle object. In fact, a thought is not a thought because it is objectless. And objectlessness is the quality of consciousness. Knowledge is the quality of consciousness. We have covered this in the beginning of Atma Nirvriti. Therefore, I am this formless, this changeless, this non-duality that is referred to as I. That brings us to the last verse of this chapter, verse 7. What binds us? There's nothing but thought. But when you see clearly that thought does not exist, then where is bondage? When an ordinary man who believes himself to be the body, when he sees an object, he emphasizes the object part of it and completely ignores the most important part, that is consciousness. When he is consumed by the object part of it, that is thought itself. That is his bondage. But when a jnani, an Advaitin, an Ajatavadan sees the same object, he sees it not as an object but as consciousness itself. He emphasizes only the consciousness part of it, and he feels that it is the self. Thus, for a jnani, every perception doubly reaffirms his knowledge that he is consciousness. He understands that even when he sees thoughts, perceptions, sensations, feelings, he is seeing truth itself. There is only consciousness. There is only Brahman. When such a jnani, an enlightened one, an awakened one, is asked, isn't this world simply a bondage for you? Isn't this body of yours simply bondage for you? He looks around, he looks at his body, and he says, what world? There is only Brahman. We will stop here and dive deeper into exploring this truth in depth in our own experiential recognition. So you have 5 homeworks this week. 1. Do I recognize the 3 separate planes in my direct experience? Not intellectual understanding, but in my direct experience. 2. Do I recognize that perception and thought belong to 2 separate planes and they cannot come in contact with each other? 3. Do I recognize that one thought cannot exist in another thought? 4. Do I recognize that an objectless thought is nothing but knowledge, is nothing but consciousness, is nothing but I? I am the single screen. Do I recognize that thought does not exist? Hence, there is no possibility of bondage at all. So let's go into silence, if possible, for the rest of the day and extend it into the week, and just dive into these 5 self-recognitions or self-explorations or 5 points of self-inquiry. Dive into aparoksha jnana. Find the answers within. They cannot be just glimpses. They have to be your solid reality before we can move deeper into Ajatavad. Other people's answers, other people's knowledge will not help here. So don't piggyback on other people's sharing. Dive deep within into yourself and recognize the truth. Keep exploring. I will see you next week. Bye-bye.